I will begin with the truth, not a story. At 98 years old, I do not believe the body is fragile by design. I believe it is obstructed. And when you remove what obstructs it, something remarkable happens. It begins to return to health. That is the main point. I'm not speaking about miracles. I'm not promising cures. I'm not saying that food guarantees anything. What I'm saying is simpler and in many ways more powerful. A whole food, plant-based diet allows the body to restore functions it already knows how to perform. The word allows matters. It does not force. It does not override biology. It removes interference. For most of my early life, I treated symptoms as enemies and food as entertainment. I believed aging meant inevitable decline. I believed disease was written into fate. But over decades, I began to see a pattern. When I removed heavily processed foods, excess animal fats, and chemical additives, and replaced them with vegetables, fruits, legumes, intact grains, nuts, and seeds, my body responded not with drama, but with quiet correction. Blood markers improved, inflammation eased, energy stabilized, digestion normalized. It was not instant. It was not magical. It was biological. Health, I came to understand, is not something we manufacture. It is something we permit. The body carries intrinsic regulatory intelligence. It balances hormones, repairs tissue, modulates immunity, and clears waste if we stop overwhelming it. Disease, in many cases, is deviation from that equilibrium. And the shift back does not begin with medication. It begins with removal of interference and alignment with design. That is the principle I have lived by for decades. Let me take you deeper into what I mean by removing interference, because that phrase changed my life. When I was in my 50s, I began to experience what most people politely call normal aging. My joints stiffened. My blood pressure crept upward. My fasting glucose edged higher each year. I was told this was predictable. I was told to expect prescriptions. I was told that genetics and time were simply collecting their debt. But I began asking a different question. What if the body is not failing? What if it is adapting to what I consistently feed it? That question shifted everything. I studied quietly. I observed populations with low rates of metabolic disease. I looked at dietary patterns rather than single nutrients. And one pattern appeared again and again. Diets centered on whole, minimally processed plant foods were associated with lower inflammation, better insulin sensitivity, healthier lipid profiles, and more stable energy regulation. Notice the language. Associated, linked, correlated, not guaranteed, not absolute. What struck me was not a miracle claim. It was a mechanistic one. Whole plant foods are dense in fiber. Fiber modulates blood sugar response and nourishes the gut microbiome. A diverse microbiome produces short-chain fatty acids that influence immune regulation and inflammatory signaling. Plants contain phytonutrients that act as antioxidants and cellular signaling molecules. Intact grains and legumes digest slowly, reducing glycemic volatility. Nuts and seeds provide fats that support vascular function without the inflammatory load associated with excessive processed fats. When I gradually shifted my diet toward vegetables, legumes, fruits, intact grains, and away from processed meats, refined sugars, and heavily manufactured foods, something subtle occurred. My laboratory numbers did not transform overnight, but they began trending in a different direction. Inflammatory markers declined, my LDL cholesterol lowered, my blood pressure stabilized without escalation of medication. My energy became consistent instead of volatile. What changed? I did not heal myself. I did not overpower biology. I removed chronic metabolic stress. That is the biological reset claim. The body possesses regulatory systems designed to maintain equilibrium, glucose regulation, lipid metabolism, immune surveillance, cellular repair. But these systems operate under load. When dietary inputs repeatedly spike glucose, overload lipid transport pathways, and trigger inflammatory cascades, the body compensates. Compensation sustained over decades becomes pathology. When the load decreases, compensation eases. That is not magic. That is physiology. The phrase return to health does not mean reversal of every condition. It does not mean erasing structural damage or genetic disorders. It means allowing regulatory systems to function closer to their intended range. There is humility in this perspective because it acknowledges boundaries. Severity of disease matters, duration of dysfunction matters, genetics matters, environmental exposure matters, adherence matters, socioeconomic reality matters, access to quality food matters. A whole food, plant-based pattern allows restoration. It does not command it. When I adopted this pattern fully in my 60s, I experienced something more powerful than lab improvements. I experienced stability. Hunger signals normalized. Cravings diminished. My weight gradually aligned without aggressive dieting. Sleep improved. My digestion became predictable. Predictability is a sign of physiological coherence, and coherence is a sign of reduced stress load. Many people misunderstand this approach as restriction. In truth, it felt like expansion. My meals became colorful. My fiber intake increased dramatically. My micronutrient density improved. My palate recalibrated. Over time, what once felt like discipline became preference. Now, at 98, I am not claiming immortality. I have lost friends. I have endured surgeries. I have faced illnesses. But I recover more efficiently than many decades younger than I am. My inflammatory markers remain modest. My cognitive clarity remains steady. My mobility remains functional. Again, not perfect, functional. I attribute this not to a superfood, not to a supplement, not to a detox protocol, but to long-term dietary alignment. There are hidden assumptions embedded in what I am saying, and I want to speak them clearly. First, that many chronic conditions are strongly influenced by lifestyle factors. Second, that excessive processed foods and animal-heavy dietary patterns can increase metabolic burden in susceptible individuals. Third, that plant-dominant eating reduces that burden for many people. Fourth, that the human organism evolved consuming large quantities of fibrous plant material relative to modern diets. These are not slogans. They are interpretive frameworks supported by large bodies of nutritional epidemiology and mechanistic research. But I must emphasize again, supported does not mean universally determinative. A diet can lower risk. It can improve biomarkers. It can enhance metabolic resilience. It cannot override every variable in existence. What it can do, and what it did for me, is restore margin. Margin between stress and breakdown. Margin between inflammation and repair. Margin between energy spikes and crashes. Margin is what allows longevity with quality. The psychological dimension of return to health may be as important as the biological one. When you frame disease as deviation rather than identity, you regain agency. You are not broken beyond repair, you are overwhelmed. Remove the overwhelming factors, permit regulation, support repair. This is not heroic medicine. It is quiet alignment. I did not wake up one morning at 75 suddenly transformed. The shift occurred across years, and that is perhaps the most honest truth I can offer. Restoration is gradual, cells turn over, blood vessels remodel, the microbiome reshapes, inflammatory cascades recalibrate. None of this happens in a week, but the body responds to consistent input. At 98, I do not preach perfection. I eat simply. I favor vegetables, legumes, fruits, intact grains, nuts, seeds. I minimize processed foods. I moderate oils. I do not chase extremes. I allow, and allowing has been enough. By the time I reached my 70s, the shift was no longer an experiment. It had become my way of living. And that is where many people misunderstand this entire philosophy. They search for a dramatic turning point, a before and after photograph, a heroic recovery story. But what truly sustains health over decades is not drama. It is consistency. When I speak of a whole food, plant-based diet allowing the body to return to health, I am speaking of long-term biological cooperation. The human organism is governed by regulatory systems designed for balance. Blood sugar is tightly controlled within narrow ranges. Blood pressure adjusts moment to moment. The immune system calibrates inflammation and resolution. The liver processes fats and toxins. The kidneys filter waste. The gut communicates constantly with the brain through neural and hormonal pathways. These systems are dynamic. They are adaptive. They are intelligent. But intelligence under chronic strain becomes dysregulation. For years before my dietary shift, I ate what was convenient. Refined carbohydrates produced rapid glucose spikes followed by crashes. Saturated fats accumulated in my bloodstream, affecting lipid transport and vascular elasticity. Processed foods, stripped of fiber, moved quickly through digestion, offering calories without structural nourishment. I did not feel ill every day. That is important. Disease often develops quietly, beneath perception, but internally, my regulatory systems were working harder than necessary. When I transitioned to predominantly whole plant foods, Something subtle but profound occurred. Variability decreased. My post-meal glucose swing softened. My digestion slowed in a beneficial way because fiber increased transit time. The microbiome shifted gradually, and with it, my immune reactivity changed. I noticed fewer minor infections. Recovery from seasonal illness improved. Was this solely diet? I cannot claim exclusivity. I also walked daily. I slept consistently. I cultivated calm relationships. But diet was foundational because it occurred multiple times every day. Food is repeated exposure, and repeated exposure shapes biology. The idea that health is the body's default state is not romanticism. It is rooted in homeostasis. The body is constantly correcting. Even now, at 98, my cells repair DNA damage, regulate electrolytes, and replace worn tissue. Aging does not mean cessation of regulation. It means reduced efficiency and resilience. The question becomes, do we burden that resilience unnecessarily? Whole plant foods reduce metabolic friction in several measurable ways. High fiber intake improves insulin sensitivity by slowing glucose absorption. Phytonutrients influence gene expression through epigenetic signaling pathways. Antioxidant compounds help buffer oxidative stress, though they are not magic shields. Plant sterols can modestly reduce LDL cholesterol absorption. Diverse fibers feed gut bacteria that produce metabolites influencing inflammation and vascular tone. These mechanisms are not theoretical. They are observed in research settings. But again, allow is the operative word. A diet rich in whole plants creates an internal environment more conducive to regulation. It does not force regeneration of destroyed tissue. It does not promise reversal of advanced structural disease. It provides favorable conditions. Conditions matter. Consider a garden. If soil is depleted and overwatered, plants struggle. If you remove excess chemicals and restore nutrient balance, growth improves. The seed already knows how to grow. The soil determines how well it can. Your body is not the seed alone. It is both seed and soil. In my 80s, I faced a health scare. My blood pressure rose unexpectedly during a stressful period after losing my spouse. Grief affects physiology. Cortisol increases. Sleep fragments. Appetite changes. No diet eliminates the biology of stress. But because my baseline inflammatory and metabolic load was lower, my physician noted something interesting. My vascular markers remained relatively stable. With adjustments to stress management and slight dietary tightening, reducing sodium, increasing potassium-rich vegetables, my blood pressure normalized without escalation of medication. That experience taught me another lesson. Resilience is cumulative. You cannot control every event in life, but you can reduce chronic background stressors so that when acute stress arrives, your system has reserve capacity. Reserve capacity is what a whole food, plant-based pattern helped me build. Many assume that at 98 I must eat with rigid discipline. In truth, I eat with awareness. My meals are simple. Lentils simmered with herbs, steamed greens, fresh fruit, intact oats, beans, nuts in moderation. I avoid ultra-processed products not because they are evil, but because they displace nutrient density. My relationship with food has shifted from indulgence to partnership. I do not see food as a cure. I see it as a signal. Each meal sends biochemical messages. Some increase inflammatory mediators. Some support antioxidant pathways. Some spike insulin aggressively. Others moderate it. The body listens. Over decades, those messages accumulate. When people ask me whether this way of eating guarantees long life, I answer plainly, no. Longevity is influenced by genetics, environmental exposures, access to health care, accidents, infections, and sheer unpredictability. But can this pattern improve probability? Yes. Can it reduce risk factors? Yes. Can it restore certain biomarkers toward healthier ranges? In many cases, yes. The scientific framing must remain honest. Epidemiological studies show associations between plant-predominant diets and reduced incidence of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. Clinical interventions demonstrate improvements in lipid profiles and glycemic control in some populations, but variability remains. Individual response differs, adherence differs, cultural context differs. The psychological impact of framing health as a return is profound. When individuals believe they are irreversibly damaged, motivation collapses. When they understand that physiology is adaptable, engagement increases. Agency does not guarantee outcome, but lack of agency almost guarantees inaction. At 98, I no longer measure success in years alone. I measure it in clarity of mind, steadiness of movement, independence in daily tasks, and absence of chronic pain requiring heavy medication. Quality, not merely duration. Returning to health, in my experience, meant regaining stability. Metabolic, emotional, digestive, cardiovascular. It meant reducing unnecessary interference so my intrinsic biology could operate without constant overcompensation. I did not defeat aging. I cooperated with physiology, and cooperation sustained over decades has carried me further than I once believed possible. Let me end where I began, with the main point. At 98 years old, I do not claim to have conquered disease, nor do I pretend that food is a miracle. What I have learned through decades of quiet observation and lived experience is this. A whole food, plant-based diet allows the body to return toward balance when balance has been disturbed. It does not guarantee, it does not cure all things. It does not override genetics or fate. It allows. That word carries humility and power at the same time. Health, I have come to believe, is not something we manufacture through force. It is something we uncover when we remove what obstructs it. The body is not passive. It is constantly regulating, repairing, recalibrating. When we reduce chronic metabolic strain, excess processed foods, inflammatory overload, glycemic volatility, we reduce friction inside systems designed for equilibrium. The result over time can be stabilization. Improved markers, greater resilience, more margin between stress and breakdown. But this restoration depends on context, the severity of illness, the duration of damage, genetics, environment, adherence, and many variables beyond personal control. That is reality. Still, possibility remains. The phrase, return to health, is not a promise of perfection. It is an invitation to alignment. It suggests you are not irreparably broken. You may simply be burdened. Remove the burden where you can. Support the biology you possess. Allow the intelligence already within you to operate. I have lived nearly a century following that principle, not chasing immortality, but permitting restoration. And for me, that has been enough.